Welcome, brave souls, to Deadscape Diaries, where the shadows hide the things you can't quite explain, and the stories you're about to hear will stay with you long after the dark settles in. These aren't just tales, they're whispers from the unknown, warnings wrapped in eerie truths, all pulled from the deepest corners of forgotten places. You're about to embark on a journey through 10 chilling stories, each one darker than the last, where every step taken into the woods, every night spent in the silence of the unknown, brings you closer to the things that lie just out of reach. Buckle up, because once you've entered this world, there's no turning back. Let's begin. The wind howled through the trees as I settled into my chair at the Firewatch Tower, 80 feet above the forest floor. The sun was slipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the vast expanse of pine trees and rocky hills that stretched for miles. I was alone, of course. Firewatching isn't exactly a popular gig, especially in the off-season. But that suited me just fine. It was the solitude I craved, away from the noise of the world, the silence of the wilderness filling my senses. The radio on the desk crackled to life, but it was just static. I glanced at the clock. 7:45 p.m. It was late, but the forest was still awake, alive in its own way. The screech of an owl cut through the air, followed by the rustle of leaves as some unseen animal made its way through the underbrush. There was a certain eeriness to the quiet at night, but I had learned to embrace it. This was my sanctuary. Still, something felt off tonight. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just an unsettling sensation that prickled the back of my neck. I told myself it was nothing. My shift would end soon, and I could head back to the ranger station for a warm bed and a hot meal. The radio crackled again, but this time, there was a voice. "Firewatcher, this is Ranger Jackson. Do you copy?" I grabbed the mic and pressed the button. "Copy, Ranger Jackson." "What's up?" "We've got a report of some strange activity near the eastern ridge. Some hikers mentioned seeing something moving. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Keep your eyes peeled." Strange activity? That didn't sit right with me. It could be anything, some curious animal, maybe even a trick of the light. Still, I knew I had to be cautious. The last thing I needed was to miss something important. "I'll keep an eye out," I said, though I wasn't sure how much I could see in the growing darkness. After a few moments of silence, the radio went dead. The static faded, leaving only the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. I turned my gaze back to the eastern ridge. It was hard to make out much in the dim light, but I could swear I saw something. A flicker, a movement. Something that wasn't quite right. I leaned forward, pressing my face against the cold glass of the observation window, squinting into the gloom. There it was again. A shape, tall and thin, moving between the trees. But it wasn't an animal. It stood upright. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was a person, someone lost in the woods. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, almost too quiet. As if whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't want to be heard. The hairs on my neck stood up. My instincts screamed at me to lock the door and call for backup, but I couldn't move. The shape moved again, this time closer. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but the figure continued its approach, as if it was ignoring the breeze that made the leaves shiver. I stared, my breath coming faster, my palms sweating against the cold metal of the radio. I fumbled for the mic, hands shaking. "Ranger Jackson, come in," I said, my voice unsteady. "Do you copy?" Nothing but static. I glanced at the clock. 8:15 p.m. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure anymore. It was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't help but feel like the trees themselves were closing in on me. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, but tonight it felt different. The shape moved into view, fully illuminated for a moment by the moonlight. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were elongated, and it swayed as it walked, like it was struggling to maintain its balance. The skin, if that's what it was, seemed pale, too pale, almost ghostly. And its eyes, they glowed. Not like the reflection of light in an animal's eyes, but a deep, eerie luminescence that seemed to pierce through the night. It was looking directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back from the window, my pulse racing. I grabbed for the radio again, desperate. "Ranger Jackson," I shouted, but still, there was only static. I turned to the door. I had to lock it. Had to make sure I was safe. But the lock wouldn't engage. My hands were shaking too much. The figure was still there, standing in the clearing now. It tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. Its mouth opened, wide, too wide, and I saw teeth. Sharp, jagged teeth. And then it moved again, faster this time. Too fast. It lunged towards the tower. I slammed my hand against the door, finally getting it to lock just as the figure reached the base of the tower. I could hear its breathing, low and raspy, almost like it was trying to mimic human sound. The tower creaked beneath its weight, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that it was trying to climb. The wind howled louder. The trees around me groaned in protest as the thing outside scraped its fingers along the walls. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. There were no sounds of claws on wood, just the low scrape of something unnatural, something wrong. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I grabbed the radio again, forcing my voice through the panic. "Ranger Jackson, I need backup. Now!" I screamed. But all that answered was the static. The figure outside made another horrible sound. A low growl, almost like a laugh. It knew I was in here. I was trapped. I had no idea how long I sat there, huddled in the corner of the tower, listening to the creature scratching and clawing at the door. The sound never stopped. My body was frozen, my mind spinning. Eventually, the noise stopped. For a few moments, the forest was dead silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I dared not move. I held my breath, waiting. Then, I heard the crackle of the radio again. "Firewatcher, this is Ranger Jackson. Do you copy?" I almost couldn't respond. My throat was dry, my voice lost in the horror I'd just experienced. I hear you," I finally choked out. "Listen, we've received some disturbing reports from other rangers. There's been talk of strange creatures in the area. Unexplainable movements. You're not alone out there. Stay inside the tower. We're coming for you." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but as soon as the words were out, I heard it again. The scratching. And this time, it wasn't outside the tower. It was inside. And with that, we leave behind the haunting solitude of the Firewatch Tower and step into something even darker. Stay with us as we move into a new tale, one that promises to send a chill down your spine. You're listening to Deadscape Diaries, where the shadows are always waiting. It was my first season as a fire lookout, and I had no idea what to expect. The position had seemed perfect, remote, quiet, a chance to clear my head. A few weeks in, I found myself stationed in a remote tower at the edge of a dense national park. My days were filled with staring out over the vast expanse of trees, keeping an eye out for smoke or any signs of fire. My only companion was the radio, and I quickly learned to relish the silence. But then, there were the whispers. It started on my third week. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The tall pines that surrounded the tower swayed, their branches creaking and groaning in the breeze. But when the whispering seemed to follow me, when I heard it during the moments when the wind was still, it unsettled me. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like soft murmurs, just beyond hearing. A constant hum that seemed to pulse through the air. I tried to ignore it at first, blaming the isolation and the strange quiet of the forest. But the more I heard, the more it gnawed at me. One evening, as dusk settled over the trees and the sky bled into an inky purple, I heard it again. It was faint at first, just a rustle of breath. But then, a voice broke through the murmur. Low and soft, it said my name. Eli. I froze. The radio was off, the air outside was still, and I was alone. The sound came from the trees, deep within the forest, just beyond the tower's reach. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like the wind either. I leaned against the railing, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice, it didn't sound threatening. It wasn't loud or demanding, just a gentle whisper, as if someone was trying to get my attention from far away. Another whisper, this time clearer, come closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. Something in my gut told me it was wrong, that this wasn't just some animal or weather anomaly. But the voice was persistent, almost coaxing, as if it knew I was listening. I picked up the radio, my hands shaking. Tower to base, I said, my voice more forceful than I intended. Is anyone there? Static. Then a crackle, followed by a voice, my supervisor, Jim. Eli? Is everything okay? I hesitated. Could I explain? How could I? He would think I was losing it. The wind had picked up again, and the whispers seemed to fade, merging with the soft hum of the trees. Everything's fine, Jim, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Just had some strange wind sounds. I'll check in later. The radio clicked off, and I stood there, feeling a chill creep along my spine. Something about the forest felt wrong. The trees felt like they were watching me. The whispering grew fainter, but it didn't stop. It was there, always in the background, like an itch I couldn't scratch. As days went on, the whispers intensified. It wasn't just during the night anymore, it was all the time. During the day, the trees murmured. At night, it was like the forest itself was breathing. One afternoon, after hearing the whispers again, this time, Clear as day, Eli, come find us. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my pack, slinging it over my shoulder, and took the trail down toward the woods. The moment my feet hit the forest floor, the whispers grew louder. They were coming from all directions now, not just one spot. I followed them deeper into the trees, my heart racing in anticipation. What was it? Who was it? The trees parted before me as if guiding me. I pushed forward, the dense underbrush cracking underfoot, the whispers growing to a maddening crescendo. My legs began to shake, but I pressed on. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the trees parted once more, revealing an open clearing. It was empty. Completely still. Except for the figure standing in the center. It was a woman. Or, rather, it looked like a woman. Her back was to me, but I could tell her face was obscured by something, like a hood, or some kind of dark mist. Her body was unnaturally still, but she didn't feel like a person. The air around her felt wrong. The whispers stopped. I took a step forward. The woman didn't move. Her form was hazy, like a mirage, flickering in and out of focus. Then, she turned, ever so slowly. Her face was pale, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were black voids, empty and deep. The whispers were back, louder than ever, now all coming from her. Eli, she whispered, her voice soft and distorted, as if coming from miles away. Come closer. You're the last one. I stumbled backward, panic flooding my veins. No! I shouted, turning to run, but the world around me twisted. The trees stretched and warped, the ground beneath me shifting like a living thing. I didn't know how long I ran. The woods seemed endless, but eventually, I found myself back at the tower. The clearing was gone, the woman gone, and the whispers, had they ever been real? I spent the rest of the night with every light in the tower on, listening to the static of the radio and the strange hum of the trees. I kept hearing the whispers, even now, like they were following me, knowing my every move. The next morning, I contacted base, telling them I was feeling ill, too shaken to return to the lookout. They never questioned me. They just told me to get some rest and send someone to replace me. The replacement arrived, and I left, heading straight for the nearest town. It's been weeks since I've been back, but I can still hear it, whispering, calling to me in the dead of night. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face. The woman with the black eyes. I don't know what she wants, or why she chose me. But I'll never go back to that tower. I can't. And if you ever find yourself at that same lookout, in that same national park, don't listen to the whispers. Because once they know you're listening, they'll never stop. And with that chilling tale behind us, we turn the page to another story, a new corner of the Deadscape to explore. So, sit back, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for what's to come, as we delve into the unknown once more. I've been working as a park ranger in Pine Hollow for over 5 years. It's a quiet place, one of those parks that doesn't get the same kind of attention as the big ones. No sprawling visitor centers, no massive tour groups, just towering pines, quiet trails, and the occasional family passing through. Perfect for a hermit like me. Or, at least, that's how I used to feel about it. There's always a tension in the air at dusk in the hollow, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath. Maybe that's why I never minded the isolation too much. I was used to the silence, the emptiness. But then, it started. It was a crisp autumn evening, and I was closing up the park's small visitor center for the night. The sky was stained with streaks of pink and orange as the sun dipped behind the mountains, and a fog was beginning to creep up the trailheads. It was that time of year again, when the evenings get darker quicker, and the whispers of the wind through the trees feel a little more deliberate. I was locking the front door of the center when I first heard it, a soft, whistling sound, barely audible at first, like a distant melody caught in the wind. I paused, frowning, my hand still gripping the door handle. It sounded like someone was calling out to me. I turned, scanning the empty parking lot and the quiet trail that wound its way into the forest. There was nothing there, of course. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself. But it didn't sound like wind. It was too precise, too rhythmic. And it seemed off. Unnatural. Like a human whistle, but warped. I shrugged it off, locking the door and heading toward the ranger station just down the hill. The sound followed me, just on the edge of hearing. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. After all, I'd been here for years and never heard anything like it before. But as I made my way to the station, the whistling grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. I glanced over my shoulder. There, at the edge of the tree-line, a figure stood. It was barely visible in the growing dusk, but I could make out the shape of a person, standing stock still. Their outline was hazy, blending with the fog rolling in from the forest. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. Something wasn't right. I called out, trying to break the tension in my voice. "Hey! Can I help you?" No answer. But the whistling grew louder, almost like the person was mocking me, taunting me with this eerie, ghostly tune. I stepped forward, squinting through the fog, trying to make out more details. The figure didn't move, but the whistling never stopped. The sound had an almost hypnotic quality to it, like it was reaching into my mind. I took another cautious step forward, my flashlight cutting through the mist. That's when I saw it, the figure's face. It wasn't a face at all. It was featureless, just a smooth, pale mask of skin, stretched taut over a skull. No eyes. No nose. No mouth. Just that empty face, staring back at me from the depths of the forest. My heart skipped a beat. The whistling ceased abruptly, and the figure took a step closer. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice shaky. There was no response, only the continued soft whistle, louder now, but not from the figure. No, the whistling was coming from everywhere, surrounding me, coming from deep within the forest. It was as if the trees themselves were breathing, whistling in unison, a sound that scraped against my nerves. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. I turned, running as fast as my legs could carry me, back toward the ranger station. But the whistling followed me, echoing in my ears, and the figure. I could still feel it watching me from the shadows. Its faceless gaze burned into my mind. I didn't stop running until I reached the station, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I leaned against the wooden wall, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I must have imagined it, right? That figure, that sound, it couldn't have been real. but the whispers persisted. They still do, every night when the sun begins to set. I hear the whistling, soft and haunting, coming from somewhere deep in the trees. Sometimes, I'll catch glimpses of movement at the edge of the forest, but when I look closer, there's nothing there. I've asked the other rangers about it. They all give me strange looks, as though they know exactly what I'm talking about but are too afraid to say anything. One of them even mentioned a name, the Whistler of Pine Hollow. Apparently, the stories go back decades, long before I ever took the job here. People say that when the fog rolls in and the trees begin to hum with that eerie whistle, something is watching. Something old. Something hungry. I'm starting to believe them. The whistling won't stop. It's only getting louder, and it's only getting closer. I used to think I could handle the isolation, that I was stronger than the stories. But now, every time the sun dips below the horizon, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, waiting for me. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear its footsteps in the fog. I wonder how long it will be before it finds me. And with that chilling tale of Pine Hollow behind us, we step deeper into the world of the unknown. The dark corners of the world always seem to have something waiting, something watching. So, keep your lights close, your ears sharp, and stay tuned, because up next on Deadscape Diaries, we've got another story that'll make you question just how safe you really are. Let's dive in. I never thought I'd end up as a fire watcher. When I first took the job, it was for the solitude, the peace of it all. An escape from the noise of the city, from the endless buzz of phones and people. Just me, a radio, and the vast stretch of forest that surrounded me. What could go wrong, right? I was stationed high up in the Rockies, in a tower perched on a remote peak. The view was breathtaking, especially at dusk when the sun dipped low and painted the mountains in hues of orange and purple. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds, the rustling of wind through the trees, and the distant calls of coyotes echoing from the valley below. But there was one thing the brochures didn't mention. Something lurked in the woods, something that didn't belong. It started on the third night. A howl. Deep, guttural, and unmistakably not from any animal I knew. It shattered the silence like a knife through glass. At first, I thought it might be a wolf, though I'd never heard a wolf like that before. The sound was too otherworldly. Too primal. Too human. I stood at the window, peering down into the dark forest below. My heart raced, and I almost reached for the radio to check in with the nearest ranger station, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to look like a fool. Maybe it was just a bear, or a cougar. I had been in these woods before. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the howls kept coming. They started low, distant at first, then grew louder, closer, and more frantic. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The air felt wrong. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd heard the stories before. The locals talked about them in hushed tones, the creatures that roamed the forests at night. They called them the dogmen, part man, part wolf, with glowing yellow eyes and jaws that could crush bone with ease. No one ever saw them, not really. But there were always stories. A set of claw marks on a tree, a strange trail in the dirt, or the occasional mutilated carcass of a deer. things that couldn't quite be explained. That night, I could feel their presence. As the hours dragged on, the howls grew closer still, until it sounded like they were right outside the base of my tower. I tried to tell myself it was just a bear, maybe a pack of coyotes. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something more sinister was out there, and it was hunting. The wind picked up, and the trees began to sway as if in warning. Then, I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor below. They were circling the base of the tower. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the window. The beam barely cut through the darkness, but I swear I saw something. A figure, tall and hunched, moving with a predatory grace. It was walking on two legs, but its gait wasn't human. It was almost like a wolf. Its arms, if they were even arms, hung lower than they should, dragging along the ground as it stalked the perimeter of the tower. I froze. It was too big to be a man. Too broad, too monstrous. My mind screamed at me to call for help, but I knew it was pointless. The nearest ranger station was miles away. No one would reach me in time. Not if whatever this thing was had any idea of what I was. The creature's growl sent a chill through me. My skin felt clammy, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I watched it move, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from my flashlight. It circled closer, then stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, staring up at the tower with those glowing yellow eyes. I backed away from the window, barely able to keep my breathing steady. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay in the tower with that thing down below. But how? The Firewatch tower had only one way out, down a rusty metal ladder that led straight into the woods. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the essentials, water, a first aid kit, my flashlight, and slowly made my way to the trapdoor. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew staying in that tower was not an option. Just as I reached for the door, the howl came again. This time, it was close. Too close. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. The thing was climbing the tower. I could hear its weight on the rungs of the ladder. The ground trembled as it ascended. Every step sounded like a thunderclap, and I knew it wouldn't be long before it reached me. I had no choice. I flung open the trapdoor and sprinted down the ladder, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't dare look up, not even once. I just ran. I bolted into the woods, not caring where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The howl echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine, but I kept moving, pushing myself harder. The trees whipped by, the branches scratching at my skin, but I didn't care. I could feel the creature behind me, its breath hot and ragged on the back of my neck, its steps growing closer and closer. I stumbled over a rock, but caught myself before hitting the ground. My flashlight flickered out, and the darkness swallowed me whole. Panic gripped me, and I ran harder, fueled by adrenaline. I didn't know where I was going or if I'd make it, but I couldn't stop now. Then, I heard it, the creature's howl, right in my ear. I turned just in time to see the glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the shadows. My heart slammed in my chest, and I gasped for air as I realized it was too late. It had caught up to me. Suddenly, a sharp, agonizing pain exploded in my side. I collapsed to the ground, the weight of the creature pressing down on me. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the night. My last thought was that I would never make it back to the tower. I would never see daylight again. The howl rang out one final time before everything went silent. The next morning, rangers found my tower abandoned. No sign of a struggle. My flashlight was found on the ground outside the tower, its lens cracked. The only evidence of my presence was a trail of blood leading into the woods. But there was no body. No remains. Just the silence of the mountains, and a haunting, distant howl echoing through the trees. The Firewatch Tower stood empty, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. But no one would ever come close to that place again. Not after what happened to me. And as for the creature that chased me, it still prowls the woods. They say if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear the sound of claws scraping on metal. And with that terrifying tale of the fire watcher and the creature lurking in the woods, we find ourselves at the edge of another eerie journey. The night has only just begun, and there are more chilling stories waiting to be uncovered. Stay with us as we step into the unknown once again. Now, let's move on to another unsettling tale from the Deadscape Diaries. I never thought a simple hike could change everything. I was just looking for an escape from the grind, a weekend to clear my head. You know the kind of trip. Pack up your backpack, lace up your boots, and just lose yourself in nature. No plan. No itinerary. Just walk until you find a spot, sit down, and let the world slow around you. I had no idea what waited for me at the end of that hike. I found the spot, or so I thought. It was an isolated clearing deep in the woods, far enough from the main trails that I hadn't encountered anyone for hours. The trees here were older, twisted, their roots gnarled into the earth as though trying to crawl their way back to some long-forgotten place. There was something strange about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I chalked it up to the isolation, the quiet, and the overhanging clouds that seemed to thicken the air. I sat down on a large rock at the edge of the clearing and pulled out my water bottle, drinking in the silence. The wind barely stirred the leaves. The only sound was the occasional rustle of branches and the distant call of birds. Nothing to be afraid of. Just nature. And then it happened. It started with a low hum, so faint I almost thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But no, it grew louder, like the vibrations from a distant engine, or the hum of a power line on a hot summer day. I stood up, turning in circles, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. Just the hum. I walked a few steps deeper into the clearing, and that's when I saw it. A ripple in the air. It was subtle at first, like a heat wave rising off the pavement, but this wasn't the kind of distortion that would shimmer in the heat of the day. It was wrong. Like looking through water, or staring into the center of a soap bubble. And then, without warning, the air split open. I know how insane that sounds, but I swear on everything I've ever known, the world around me cracked like glass. The sky, once a dull gray, twisted into hues I couldn't recognize, purple and black swirling together like a sickening bruise. The trees warped and bent as if their very essence was being sucked into the rift, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. I didn't know what to do. Instinct kicked in. I turned and ran. It was all I could do. But no matter how fast I moved, the rift, the thing that was opening up, followed me. It was pulling everything in, warping reality like it was nothing more than a piece of paper in the wind. The trees bent inward, as if they, too, were trying to escape whatever was coming. I stumbled back toward the edge of the clearing, but as I did, the world around me lurched. The ground gave way beneath my feet. I fell, hard, slamming into something cold, unyielding. My breath was knocked from my lungs as I scrambled to my feet. And that's when I realized it. I wasn't in the clearing anymore. The forest was gone. I was standing in a place that defied everything I knew about the world. The sky above me was black, no stars, no moon, just empty. The ground was a shifting, cracked landscape, covered in a layer of dust that sparkled in the eerie, unnatural light. The trees that surrounded me were twisted, their bark a deep shade of red, their limbs moving unnaturally in the breeze. There was no wind here. Nothing natural. Just silence. And I wasn't alone. A sound broke the quiet, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The sound of something large moving toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the noise. It was him. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. I couldn't tell if it was human, or something else, something wrong. But one thing was clear, it was coming for me. There was no mistaking the intent in its slow, methodical steps. I could hear its breath, heavy and unnatural, filling the space between us. I froze, unable to move. Closer it came. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something sharp in the dark. My hand flew to the ground to catch myself, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of them. Tiny pinpricks of light scattered across the landscape, watching me. Observing. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. The figure behind me moved faster, its presence growing closer with every step. The ground beneath me cracked open in sharp, jagged angles, as if the very earth was alive, pulling me down, trying to swallow me whole. But I didn't dare look back. The footsteps grew louder, and so did my fear. In the distance, I saw it, what I hoped was an escape. A light. A doorway. Something familiar. I reached for it, my lungs burning, legs screaming for relief, but the figure wasn't far behind. And then, just before I could reach the light, the ground gave way. I fell. My body tumbled into an abyss, and the world went dark. When I woke up, the light was gone. The landscape had shifted again. I was still here, stuck in this nightmare dimension. And the figure was still out there. I don't know how I'll ever get back, or if I ever will. All I know is that whatever I stepped into that day, I've been trapped in it ever since. I just hope you never have to step into this dimension, too. And just like that, we leave behind the dark, twisted realms of other dimensions and step back into our own, well, mostly our own. Or do we? The strange and unknown are never far behind in the Deadscape Diaries. So, keep your wits about you, because there's more where that came from. Stay tuned, and let's see where the darkness takes us next. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a few days of camping in the mountains to escape the grind of city life. My friends and I had been talking about this trip for months. After all the stress at work, the last thing we needed was another crowded weekend in a bar or a cramped apartment. No, we were heading into the woods, away from everything. There were 4 of us: me, Amy, Derek, and Josh. We were all eager for a break. The trail was well marked, and the campsite was a good distance from any of the main park paths. We arrived around noon, set up our tents, and spent the rest of the day hiking around the area, taking in the fresh mountain air, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. For a while, it felt like the world was ours alone. As evening fell, we gathered around the fire. The crackling flames made everything feel cozy and safe, the only sound breaking the silence being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. We laughed, told stories, and roasted marshmallows, just like any group of friends would do. But that night, things started to feel off. It was after dark when we first noticed it. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the trees just beyond the firelight. We all assumed it was a deer or some other animal, harmless and uninterested in us. But as the evening wore on, the sounds grew louder. The twigs snapping underfoot, the crunch of dry leaves, it all sounded wrong, as if whatever was out there was deliberately moving closer, circling us. "Did you guys hear that?" Josh asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded, but no one said anything for a while. The sounds weren't normal, but nothing we could pinpoint. It was just wrong. Amy pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Probably just a bear or something. "We've got the fire, we'll be fine." But even as she said it, I could see the unease in her eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. There was something watching us from the trees, and I wasn't sure if it was an animal or something else entirely. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. Derek and Josh crawled into their tent first, leaving Amy and I sitting by the fire for a little longer. As the firelight flickered, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder into the pitch-black woods. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart race. It felt like the shadows were shifting, moving, bending in unnatural ways. "Did you see that?" I asked Amy, my voice tight. She turned to where I was looking, her face suddenly pale. "No, but I heard it." There, at the edge of the clearing, a figure moved. It was tall, far taller than any person I'd ever seen. But it wasn't quite human either. It was more like a silhouette, a shadow standing in the trees just outside the reach of the firelight. It seemed to blend in with the darkness, its edges blurring in a way that made it impossible to make out any details. My breath caught in my throat. "What is that?" Amy's voice shook. "I don't know, but we should go inside. Now." Before we could move, the figure took a step forward. Its movements were unnaturally slow, deliberate. Every step it took echoed through the woods, reverberating in my chest. My heart pounded harder, and I found myself frozen to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from it. Suddenly, it moved, faster than I could comprehend. The shadow lunged toward us, its shape twisting and elongating as it crossed the clearing in a single stride. I heard Amy scream, and that was enough to break me out of my stupor. We bolted for the tent, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible. We dove inside, gasping for breath, and scrambled to zip it up behind us. The heavy sound of something crashing through the underbrush echoed outside. It was close. Too close. Derek and Josh were already awake, their faces pale with fear. "What the hell is going on?" Josh demanded. I didn't know how to explain it. I could hardly breathe, let alone put into words the terror I felt. All I could do was point toward the door of the tent, my eyes wide with panic. We all huddled together in the darkness, listening as the sounds outside grew louder. The rustling in the trees was gone, replaced by the unmistakable sound of something circling the tent. It was stalking us. I could hear its breath. The sharp, shallow inhales, as if it was just waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew that would be the end of us. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time felt like it had stopped altogether. We dared not speak, not wanting to draw its attention. But then, a loud thud, like something heavy slamming into the side of the tent, made us all jump. Derek cursed under his breath. "It's trying to get in." The thudding continued, shaking the tent as though whatever was outside was testing its strength. We held our breath, praying the thin fabric of the tent would hold, praying whatever it was would lose interest. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Complete silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, but something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. It was just waiting. Watching. I looked around at my friends. Amy was trembling in the corner, Derek and Josh clutching their flashlights like weapons, but they were as terrified as I was. We had no plan, no way out. We were trapped. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, in the distance, I thought I heard a howl. It was deep and guttural, almost like a wolf, but much louder, much more primal. And it was getting closer. The air outside seemed to shift. It felt heavier, like the darkness itself was pressing in on us. The forest, once peaceful and inviting, now seemed suffocating, hostile. We had no choice but to try to survive the night and hope we made it until morning. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just outside the circle of light, its eyes fixed on us, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. And that's when we realized we weren't in the woods anymore. We were in its domain. As the shadows in the woods close in, and the night creeps ever closer to its darkest hour, we leave behind our terrified campers. What was once a peaceful escape has become something much more sinister. But the story doesn't end there. Stay tuned as we shift from the unknown dangers of the forest into another chilling tale, where reality bends and something far darker awaits. It was another quiet evening in the park, the sun dipping low behind the treetops as I made my rounds. The forest was peaceful, too peaceful, in fact. No hikers, no wildlife stirring. Just the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze and the soft crunch of my boots on the gravel path. I wasn't used to this kind of solitude. As a park ranger, my job was usually busy, patrolling the trails, ensuring campers had their permits, checking in on the remote campsites. But today, it was dead silent. The stillness felt unnerving, like the whole park was holding its breath. I was halfway down a path that led to one of the more secluded campsites when I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just the fading light playing tricks on me, but as I approached, my gut sank. There was a campsite up ahead. A full campsite, complete with a fire pit, tents, and backpacks, yet there was no sign of life. My first instinct was to call it in. Maybe the campers had wandered off or left in a hurry. But as I got closer, my unease grew. There was something off about this place. The air felt colder, heavier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I approached cautiously, scanning the area. No one was in sight, but the fire pit was still warm, the embers glowing faintly in the dusk. That didn't sit right with me. Campers who left always put their fires out. You didn't just leave a campfire burning. I bent down to check the fire when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I slowly stood up and turned, scanning the shadows between the trees. And that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, covered in matted, dark fur, stepped out from behind a nearby tree. Its eyes gleamed with a yellow, predatory light as it stared at me, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't tell if it was some kind of animal or something more. But it wasn't anything human. Its movements were too quick, too fluid, like it was gliding through the forest. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I just stood there, heart pounding, as the creature tilted its head, its sharp teeth glistening in the dimming light. Then, it took a step forward. And another. That's when I snapped out of it. I bolted. I don't remember how I managed to get back to the park's main road, but I didn't stop running until I reached my patrol truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the weight of what I'd seen hanging over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't explain what it was. Hell, I don't know if I want to. But I know one thing for sure, that thing wasn't human. And it's still out there. So, if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, far from the beaten path, don't be too quick to trust the quiet. Because in places like this, the night holds more than just shadows. Trust me, I know now. And that was the last night I worked in that park. Now, as our park ranger retreats from the horrors that lurk just beyond the trees, the question remains, what else is out there, waiting, watching? Let's take a moment before we move on, as we dive into yet another tale, one where things are about to get even darker. The trail was quiet, too quiet, in fact. I had been hiking for days, deep in the mountains of a remote part of Europe, far from the typical tourist trails. My goal had been to reach a hidden valley I'd heard about from some locals, an untouched patch of land where nature still ran wild. But as the sun began to set, the air turning crisp and cool, I found myself on a path that wasn't quite marked on any of my maps. I had come across what I first assumed was an abandoned village, nestled between the trees in a hollow. The stone houses were worn, the roofs caved in or missing entirely, the windows shattered. It looked like something from a forgotten time, perhaps even a ghost town. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The village was eerily silent. The trees grew close to the crumbling buildings, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I wandered down a cobblestone street, trying to take it all in. There was no sign of any animals, no sound of birds, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire place had been abandoned for centuries. I moved through the village, inspecting the ruins. Some of the houses still had remnants of furniture, a rocking chair tipped over, a cracked wooden table, the remains of a fireplace. The oddest thing, however, was the pervasive smell, earthy, damp, and something metallic, like blood. As I stepped into what might have once been a town square, something strange caught my eye. At the far end of the square stood a well. It wasn't old or crumbling like the rest of the village, it looked new. The stone walls were intact, and the wooden bucket chain appeared to be in working order. I hesitated, wondering who could have possibly maintained this, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked toward the well cautiously. That's when I noticed the markings on the stone, carved deep into the surface. At first, I thought it was some kind of religious symbol or old family crest. But as I leaned in closer, my stomach twisted. The carvings were too intricate, too unnatural. They looked like distorted figures, humanoids with elongated limbs, their faces obscured by swirling patterns. A rustling sound behind me made my blood run cold. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. I laughed nervously at myself, trying to shake off the tension. "Get a grip," I muttered. "It's just an old village. You're probably imagining things." But then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A low, gurgling sound, like something wet dragging across the stone. I froze, my eyes scanning the darkness between the ruined buildings. That's when I saw them. Figures, moving in the shadows. I could only make out their shapes, tall, hunched, their limbs impossibly long and thin, like they didn't quite fit the shape of a human body. And their eyes, bright, shining in the dark, unblinking and cold. I started backing away slowly, my heart racing. There was something wrong about the way they moved, slow and deliberate, almost like they were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The moment I turned to flee, the ground beneath me shifted. I slipped, falling to my knees on the cobblestone. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figures approaching. The growling sound had stopped, replaced by soft, rhythmic breathing. One of them stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of an old house. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Its skin was an unnatural shade of pale gray, and its eyes, dark and hollow, bore into mine as if it could see right through me. It stood motionless, waiting. And then, in a voice like the crackling of dry leaves, it spoke. "Leave. Now." I didn't need another word. I spun on my heel and ran. The trail back to the edge of the village felt like it stretched on forever, the figures still lurking just behind me, their soft steps echoing in the silence. I never looked back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed to run faster, to get away from whatever was hunting me. By the time I reached the edge of the village, I was breathless, my legs aching. But I didn't stop. Not until I was deep in the woods, far from that place. I kept telling myself that I had imagined it, that I had seen what I wanted to see in the dark, but the memory of those eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone about what happened in that village. No one would have believed me. Besides, I knew better than to go back. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I hear the soft, wet dragging sound in the distance. And I wonder, are they still waiting, and as our hiker takes one last look at the path he left behind, we find ourselves drawn into the shadows once again, standing at the edge of something far darker. Now, take a moment and brace yourself for what's next, as we move deeper into the unknown with Deadscape Diaries. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend escape. Max and I had been planning this hiking trip for months, just the two of us, far from the noise of the city, to reconnect with nature. The mountains were our sanctuary, and we'd trekked many trails before, but this one, it was special. We'd heard whispers about a secluded area known for its beauty and its eerie, untouched landscape. The kind of place you find when you leave behind all the well-trodden paths. We arrived on a chilly Friday afternoon, the sun low and the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. The air was crisp, the trees swaying gently, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. It was perfect. After setting up camp near a clearing, Max suggested we go explore a little further before it got dark. I hesitated at first. The sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows, but Max was always the adventurous one. "Come on, it'll be fun," he urged, his green eyes sparkling with excitement. Reluctantly, I agreed, and together we headed off into the woods, the evening air growing colder by the minute. We walked for about an hour, deeper into the forest, until the trees grew denser and the path less defined. It felt like we were the only people in the world. The air was thick with silence, but it didn't feel peaceful. There was something off about it. Then, we saw it. A large stone archway, overgrown with vines, stood in the middle of the clearing. It looked ancient, too ancient. The stone was darkened, worn smooth by time, and something about it felt wrong. I stopped, instinctively, a chill running down my spine. "Look at this," Max said, excited but unaware of the unease I was feeling. He reached out and touched one of the stones. The moment his hand made contact, I felt it. A vibration through the ground, a hum so faint at first that I wasn't sure if it was real, but then it grew, filling the air. It was like a pulse, slow and steady, but undeniably there. I grabbed his arm. "Max, we should go back." But Max, always the risk taker, shrugged me off. "It's just an old stone arch, probably part of a forgotten settlement. Let's take a look around." I wanted to protest, but something inside me told me not to push it. He was already moving further into the clearing, his curiosity winning out. Against my better judgment, I followed him. That's when we saw the object. In the center of the arch, half buried in the earth, was a strange, weathered box. It was made of dark wood, adorned with carvings I couldn't quite make out in the dimming light. There was a heavy, ancient lock on it, but it had been pried open. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I stepped closer. "Max, stop!" I hissed, but it was too late. He was already crouching down, running his fingers over the carvings. "Look at this," he whispered. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before." His voice trembled, and his hand hovered above the open box. For a moment, everything went still. The hum from the ground had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. "Max," I said again, a sense of dread creeping over me. "We need to leave. Now." He didn't listen. He reached into the box and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It was obsidian, black as night, with an unnatural sheen. As soon as his fingers closed around it, the ground beneath us shuddered. Max stood up abruptly, his face paling. The stone dropped from his hand and hit the ground with a hollow sound. And then the world changed. The sky darkened in an instant, and the trees twisted unnaturally, their limbs bending and stretching in ways that weren't possible. A cold wind howled through the clearing, and something, a presence, was suddenly all around us. I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving in the underbrush, and when I turned to Max, his expression had gone from confusion to sheer terror. "Did you see that?" he gasped. I didn't need to look to know what he meant. From the shadows of the trees emerged something wrong. It was tall, too tall, with skin like bark and eyes that glowed faintly red. It had no face, just a blank space where one should be, and its limbs were long and crooked, bending at unnatural angles. It stepped forward, and the air seemed to press in on us. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this thing was not of this world. "Run!" Max screamed. We didn't have time to think. We turned and sprinted back down the path, the sound of something heavy crashing behind us. I didn't dare look back. Branches snapped, thorns scraped at my skin, and the ground felt like it was pulling at my feet, but we kept running. The forest seemed to shift around us, like it was playing tricks, twisting and warping. I could hear Max's footsteps just behind me, his breathing ragged. But then, he screamed. I spun around just in time to see Max's body lift off the ground, his face frozen in terror as something unseen gripped him. His arms flailed, and his mouth opened in a silent scream as he was pulled into the darkness. "Max!" I cried, reaching out for him, but it was too late. I was alone. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing deeper. My legs burned, but I kept running, pushing myself faster. I didn't know where I was going anymore, but I couldn't stop. I could hear them now, the others, creeping through the woods, their footsteps light but relentless. They were everywhere, their eyes gleaming in the dark, their whispers almost deafening. They were hunting me. I don't remember how long I ran or how far I went. All I remember is the sound of them following, circling. Eventually, I stumbled, falling to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My legs were too weak, my body too exhausted to keep going. That's when I felt it, something cold, sharp against my neck. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Something was standing over me, its presence suffocating, its breath cold against my skin. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the pressure vanished. I turned around, half expecting to see something standing over me, but there was nothing. No creatures, no shadows. The air was still again. My heart pounded in my chest. I had survived. But Max hadn't. I didn't know what those things were, or what the stone had awakened, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out of the forest, get away from whatever curse had been unleashed. It took everything I had to find my way back to our camp. When I arrived, the tents were gone, the fire extinguished, and everything was eerily silent. I couldn't even remember how I made it back to the car. I left that place behind. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape it. The nightmarish images of Max's last moments, the things that hunted us, still haunt me. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear them whispering my name. maybe they're still out there, waiting for the next unlucky souls to stumble upon that cursed stone. And with that, we find ourselves once again in the darkest corners of the woods, where some things are best left undisturbed. But for now, we're moving on, back to the world of the unknown, where every step might lead to something far darker than you could ever imagine. Stay with us as we turn the page to the next chapter of the Deadscape Diaries. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a quick escape from the pressures of the city. Jess and I had been working non-stop for months, and when we saw the cabin nestled in the backwoods of northern Michigan, it seemed like the perfect place to unwind. Quiet, remote, no distractions. Just the two of us, some books, a bottle of wine, and the fresh, crisp air of the forest. What we didn't know, what we couldn't have possibly known, was that the woods held a much darker secret, one that would change us forever. We drove up that Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the trees. The road to the cabin wasn't paved, just a narrow dirt trail, which made the isolation all the more apparent. But that's what we were looking for, right? Peace and quiet. The cabin was everything we had hoped for, rustic, cozy, and tucked away like something out of an old postcard. The first evening was perfect. Jess and I spent hours by the fire, drinking wine and talking. But as the night wore on, something seemed off. The woods were too quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets, no rustling of leaves. It was like the forest had been swallowed whole by silence. I tried to push it out of my mind, brushing it off as just an odd feeling. But when I stepped outside to grab more firewood, I saw something, just for a split second. At the edge of the tree line, there was a figure. Tall, thin, and gaunt. Its eyes gleamed like something otherworldly, and its shadow stretched unnaturally long, even in the fading light. I froze, my heart slamming into my chest. But the figure was gone in an instant, swallowed by the dark. I hurried back to the cabin, trying to act casual. Jess was still inside, humming along to a song on the radio. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been staring too long into the fire. But as I sat back down, that unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. The rest of the evening was spent in a tense quiet. The fire crackled, but there was no warmth in it. And when we finally went to bed, Jess curled up against me, pressing her face into the pillow as she drifted off. I lay there for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to every little creak and groan the cabin made. I was on edge, convinced that something was out there. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl. Faint, like a distant echo. I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or if something else was out there. But I wasn't brave enough to check. By morning, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Jess was already up, making coffee and humming as she opened the cabin's windows to let in the crisp morning air. But I couldn't shake the feeling, not entirely. We spent the day hiking, trying to lose ourselves in the woods. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like the forest itself was closing in on us. The trees were too close, their limbs twisting in unnatural ways. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't place. We stumbled across a clearing in the woods, and that's when we saw it. A large stone, cracked and weathered, standing tall in the middle of the clearing. It looked ancient, almost as if it had been placed there by something or someone long before we arrived. Carved into its surface was an unsettling symbol, like a twisted face with hollow eyes. Jess knelt beside it, inspecting the stone. "This is weird," she muttered. "Like something out of a mythology book." I stood back, a cold sensation creeping down my spine. Maybe we should just head back to the cabin. But Jess was already reaching out, tracing her fingers along the symbol. She didn't notice the sudden shift in the air. The birds had gone silent. The wind had stopped. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Before I could warn her, the ground beneath us trembled, and the earth cracked. A loud, bone-rattling screech echoed through the woods, followed by a series of horrifying, unnatural sounds. Like something hungry, something desperate. And then, from the darkness of the trees, it emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, with thin, gnarled limbs that ended in sharp claws. Its body was emaciated, with pale skin stretched tight over bones. Its face was a grotesque mask of hunger, its eyes sunken deep into its skull. The thing was a nightmare come to life, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile full of sharp, jagged teeth. The Wendigo. It moved toward us with unnatural speed, its long, spider-like limbs reaching out for us. Jess screamed, backing away. But I couldn't move, rooted to the spot with fear. I tried to grab her, tried to pull her toward me, but the Wendigo was faster. It lunged, knocking me aside with a force that sent me crashing into the dirt. I heard Jess's screams, her cries for help, but all I could do was watch in horror as the creature grabbed her. Its mouth open wide, its teeth sinking into her flesh with a sickening sound. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, but there was nothing I could do. The Wendigo's hunger was insatiable, and Jess, my beautiful, brave Jess, was nothing more than a meal. I ran. I don't know how far I ran. But I didn't stop until I found myself at the edge of the woods, panting, exhausted, and alone. I didn't go back for her. I couldn't. The Wendigo had claimed her, and I knew, deep down, that it would not stop. It would keep hunting, driven by an endless, primal hunger. And I would be the next victim if I wasn't careful. I don't know why I'm still here, telling you this story. Maybe it's because I don't want Jess to be forgotten. Maybe it's because I need to warn you. If you ever find yourself in the woods, northern Michigan, or anywhere else for that matter, beware of the Wendigo. Because it's always hungry. And once it finds you, it will never let you go. And there you have it, another night, another twisted chapter in the Deadscape Diaries. The things you've heard tonight may fade, but trust me, the darkness lingers. As we close the book on these 10 stories, remember, the world is full of creatures, forces, and curses that don't just belong in the dark, they're waiting for you, right now. Keep your eyes open. Keep your lights on. And when the world feels a little too quiet, and the shadows grow just a little too long, don't say I didn't warn you. Thanks for listening, and remember, the Deadscape is never truly gone. It's always waiting. Until next time, keep your sanity close. The darkness is never far.